Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Frank Miller. I'm a member of the board here at the Council and the principal of the Scowcroft Group. We're all very pleased today to have the opportunity to hear from Stephen Lovegrove, who is the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Defence in London. Stephen became the Permanent Secretary in April of 2016. Prior to that, he was the Permanent Secretary for the Department of Energy and Climate Change and had a distinguished career before that, both in government and in the private sector. For those of you who don't know, the Permanent Secretary is the government's principal advisor on defense and has responsibility for policy, finance, and planning as a departmental accounting officer. The Permanent Secretary sets strategy for defense, including corporate strategy. He heads the Department of State and the MOD Civil Service, and the overall organization, management, and staffing of defense. So for those of you who are Americans and don't understand that you can actually, as a civil servant, rise to very senior positions and have real authority, you're seeing someone who actually does that in London. We appear to be approaching a crossroads in the history of the transatlantic relationship, or so the pundits would have us believe. We're seeing proto-nationalism in many NATO and European countries. We're certainly seeing proto-nationalism in Russia and an aggressive sense of trying to assert itself throughout the European space. We are seeing renewed efforts in the United States, the United Kingdom, to make large defense companies more responsive to both cost and schedule. And all of this is occurring in the midst of a great challenge to the rules-based order which emerged from World War II and underscores the importance of alliances. And it is in this context that we're going to hear from the Permanent Secretary. I've been asked to do a paid public announcement before he comes on, which is to say that for those of you who are here and those of you who are watching on computers, please join the conversation by following at AC Scowcroft and using the hashtag #specialrelationship. And with that, I give you Stephen Lovegrove, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defence in London.
Well, thank you, Frank, and I'm delighted to be here at the Atlantic Council with such a distinguished audience. I'm going to talk today about Britain's place in a rapidly changing world and offer some thoughts on the implications for us all. But before that, I should perhaps begin to build on a little of what Frank talked about and my rather archaic title of, in fact, fully Permanent Under Secretary of State, which doesn't really translate very well into American English. I don't need to tell this audience that there are some important differences between our constitutions. An example from 1962. President Kennedy and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, in Nassau, with the main business of Polaris out of the way, fell to talking of other matters. The President asked the Prime Minister how his budget was going. "Fine, thanks," said Macmillan. "No trouble in the House of Commons?" asked the President. No, replied Macmillan. "We just write the budget, throw it over the wall, and the majority approves it." "Well," said Kennedy wonderingly, "anyone could run a country like that." Another distinction, though, is that virtually all of our ministries are led by secretaries of state who are also members of Parliament. So the members of the Cabinet and the handfuls of more junior ministers who support them in leading their departments interact with their fellow parliamentarians nearly every single day. And everyone below those ministers is a career official. We have no political appointees like in your system, although I am aware right now that you have rather fewer than you're used to. We always have only a very few political advisors, and a handful in the Prime Minister's office apart, political advisors can't issue instructions to civil servants at all. The role of the Permanent Secretary, as Frank outlined, my job is to lead the department as it supports the government of the day. I'm the principal policy and management advisor to the Defence Secretary. I work in close harness with the Defence Secretary's principal military advisor, the Chief of the Defence Staff, the CDS. Day by day, I run the department, the CDS gives strategic direction to operations, and we come together to try and make it all add up. Together, the CDS and I are the defence voice at the National Security Council officials meetings, and we jointly chair the Defence Strategy Group. We jointly lead integrated teams of career civil servants and military officers working jointly, and that is an absolutely key characteristic of our system, and that is one of our most enormous strengths, and one I suspect that we don't make enough of or talk about enough in public. As Frank says, I was an investment banker for a very long period of my career. I don't expect any sympathy as a result of that, but I can say that from that vantage point, and also from the vantage point of not seeing the defence for a huge amount of my career, that the strengths that we have in the UK system have served us incredibly well and will continue to serve us incredibly well in the future. I could discuss the civil service and Parliament for a lot longer, but it's time for bigger things. It's traditional to begin these discussions with threats and challenges. I want to instead briefly mention some positives. The UK is the 5th largest economy in the world. We are a uniquely connected nation with alliances and partnerships the world over. We are the most trade-dependent member of the G20, and we consider that a strength. And the language of Shakespeare remains the language of commerce, of diplomacy, of society the world over. We are second only to the United States in our technological base, and by that I mean human, academic and industrial. The UK is uniquely well positioned to deliver 21st century defence, and we continue to be the home of some of the greatest high-end manufacturing companies in the world, and more on that later. We spend our money wisely. We've increased investment in defence at the same time as reducing overall government spending. We're proud to meet the NATO target of spending 2%, 2.21% actually, of our GDP on defence. The government is committed to increase defence spending by 0.5% above inflation in each year of this Parliament running out to 2020. And we are also proud of spending 0.7% of our national income on overseas development aid, reducing the risk of future conflicts. In fact, we are the only country in the world to hit both that 2% NATO target and the 0.7% overseas development target. We remain an outward-looking nation. As the Prime Minister said in January, the UK is and shall remain a secure, prosperous, tolerant country, a magnet for international talent, and a home to the pioneers and innovators who will shape the world ahead. The British government reaffirmed those spending commitments alongside publishing our Strategic Defence and Security Review, SDSR, in 2015. We're proud of that strategy document, both in the judgments that we made, many of which have proved perhaps regrettably prescient, and in the progress we've made since delivering our objectives. I don't need to rehearse, and I won't rehearse, the increasingly challenging global security context for this audience. But briefly, our SDSR concluded that the UK defence and security needed to respond to 4 main challenges. First, the increased threat posed by terrorism, extremism and instability. Second, the resurgence of state-based threats and intensifying wider state competition. Third, the impact of technology, especially cyber and network issues, and wider technological developments. And fourth, the erosion of the rules-based international order, which makes it harder to build consensus and to tackle global threats. Some of those challenges are very much as they were in 2015. We have found no magic bullet to fix weak and failing states. We know it takes decades of toil, treasure, political commitment, and sometimes blood to develop economies, democracies, and resilient societies. Even as we deny them safe havens around the world, we know that the ambitions of Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and their like to sow poison and mayhem have not diminished. The UK is committed to playing a leading role in the global counter-Daesh coalition, contributing all the arms of government: economic, diplomatic, development, and defence. But some things have changed. Most notably, the threat from state actors has crystallised in more ways and more rapidly than perhaps we anticipated. As the Defence Secretary set out in his recent speech at St Andrews University, we have a very clear-eyed view of Russian behaviour. Alexander Litvinenko was murdered on British soil in 2006. In 2015, the annexation of Crimea and the shooting down of MH17 in 2014, then its intervention in Syria, all showed how Russia had become more aggressive. But 2016 saw a further step change in Russian behaviour. It is seeking to expand its sphere of influence, destabilise countries and weaken the alliance. It seeks to weaken today's international rules-based system, to write a new set of rules on their terms and reflecting their values. We are responding as an alliance to dissuade and to deter, and also to engage. As the Prime Minister has said last week, we stand ready to engage with Russia, but we are beware. The scale and breadth of those challenges, their speed of change and some other events, not least the UK's decision to leave the European Union, lead some distinguished and siren voices to suggest we need to rewrite our SDSR. We disagree. We got those threats right, and we built a robust and flexible plan to take them on. And as you all know, rewriting a strategy is an excellent excuse to avoid executing it. But that does not mean that we should not constantly test and adjust our planning. Indeed, it would be a grave error to do anything else. And when we do that, we need to remember the guiding principles of SDSR, which are to be international, innovative, and integrated. And with your forbearance, I will unpack those in turn. We decided to make our defence policy and plans international by design. Our armed forces have almost always operated alongside allies and partners, and first and foremost with NATO, the strongest military alliance the world has ever seen. NATO knows what it must now do. It must deliver greater resources, most particularly from member states who are not yet meeting the 2% target. Efficiency is not a substitute for commitment. We need both. With resources, NATO must also reform. NATO has begun that journey, and the UK is determined to lead the effort. Today, NATO has embarked on a new defence and deterrence posture, including the enhanced forward presence battalions deploying across the Baltic states and to Poland. We have a greater focus on our higher readiness forces, and we are starting to develop new responses to hybrid threats, nuclear blackmail, and cyber attack. But we now need to press the accelerator. The institutions of NATO, SHAPE, ACT, the Joint Forces Commands, and so on, all need to play a part in the transformation of NATO to a genuinely agile, flexible organisation, one in which we can have confidence that can respond quickly enough to those who wish us harm. Such an organisation requires NATO to be adaptable and responsive to the changing environment. We must therefore strive for an alliance that is less bureaucratic, better at prioritising, more capable of taking difficult decisions quickly. We must empower NATO's senior military commanders to draw on their professional experience and insight to prioritise and resource the most pressing issues for its member states. Enhanced resources and effective reform in NATO need to be married with a restored sense of relevance. If we are to carry our treasuries and our taxpayers to renewing their vows to NATO, then NATO must demonstrate through action that it contributes to tackling all of our national security challenges, including terrorism. That contribution to counter-terrorism needs to be broad-based, embracing operations but also capacity building, partnerships, awareness and intelligence. One final word on NATO. and that's to recall two of the most important words in the Washington Treaty: North Atlantic. NATO is not an organisation solely about European security. It is an alliance for Euro-Atlantic security, including the US homeland and the waters in between. We have perhaps grown too comfortable considering our shared ocean as safe, somewhere we don't need to worry too much about. That is wrong. If it ever was, it is no longer a benign environment. It is becoming again a contested space, and we must continue to work together to protect it and the trade and communication channels to which it is home. Now that's a point I could explore in other domains as well, not least space, but perhaps we'll save that for another time. NATO is the first and most important part of an international response, but it cannot be the whole answer. Against ever more complex problems, we must bring together military and non-military responses, and that means making the most of the agreement at Warsaw last year to reinvigorate the strategic relationship between NATO and the EU, including cooperation on cybersecurity and boosting counter-hybrid capabilities. The UK is today a significant contributor to EU missions around the world. We are leaving the EU, but we remain committed to European security, and we will continue to be a supporter of the EU's efforts to contribute to international peace and security. And we will continue to advocate within NATO and with our European partners for a mutually supportive relationship between NATO and the EU, which is in our and all others' national security interests. Finally, our international emphasis must include our most important bilateral relationships. I don't need to walk this audience around the extraordinary scope of the UK-US defence relationship, but it is worth dwelling on a couple of very conspicuous examples. Sometime in the 2030s, HMS Dreadnought and the USS Carolina will undertake their respective first patrols. They will each be the first of new nuclear deterrent submarines, responsible for providing the ultimate guarantees of our respective national security against the most existential threats. At their heart, each of these classes of submarines will carry Trident D5 missiles. The warheads are national assets for both of our countries, as are the firing chains to launch them. But the missiles are taken from a common stock. A missile coming off the production line doesn't know if it is destined for a UK or a US submarine. And when those missiles are lowered into the submarines, they will be stored in a common missile compartment, identical in the US and UK submarines, which has been developed by our two navies and our industry partners. Just dwell on that thought. Our respective ultimate guarantees of sovereignty, our last lines of national defence, national warheads, national firing chain, all borne on a common fleet of missiles, all holstered in a common missile compartment. No two other countries in the world trust each other enough or have the raw engineering abilities to do that. Another example. We've agreed that the US Marine Corps F-35 Joint Strike Fighters will fly from our new aircraft carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, on their first operational deployments. It will be another potent, unmatched demonstration of our depth of our commitment to each other and to working together to respond to threats to our shared security. That relationship and that commitment starts at the top, and the recognition of the historical and future joint endeavours by our respective defence secretaries is transparently and powerfully genuine. Our partnership on the F-35 programme provides us both with an unmatched fifth-generation air capability. It also provides us with considerable industrial and economic benefits, and there can be no defence without a sustainable industrial base. Today, UK and US companies constitute a single defence industrial base. British Aerospace Systems is a US company. Lockheed Martin is a UK company. We should recognise and celebrate and build on that reality, delivering a truly two-way street for defence procurement cooperation. You all know that innovation is the day job for any tactical or operational commander. It's the day job for our engineers and laboratory staff, labouring to create new capabilities to keep us safe. It's the day job for the defence industry, seeking to provide capabilities we need at prices that we can afford. Innovation is foundational to everything about defence. The UK is good at innovation. We're number 3 on the Global Innovation Index. And yet with hindsight, we can see that this has too often in the recent past been despite the actions of government rather than because of them. We became comfortable with the idea that we would always have technological superiority. We thought that stealth and precision munitions would last forever. And we missed early on the extraordinary opportunities that cyber would present our opponents to do us harm. So innovation is the second strand of our strategic response. The UK is not precisely pursuing a third offset strategy of the sort that Deputy Secretary Work has so eloquently spoken about in the last few years. Our ambition instead is to fundamentally change how we go about our business in pursuit of military advantage now and in the future. We also recognise that today technological innovation happens primarily in private enterprise rather than in government. So we've established the Defence and Security Accelerator to bring novel ideas from individuals and companies without previous defence experience in faster and more easily. That is something that we can learn a lot from the US in. We recognise that the world changes faster, so we need to invest in horizon scanning because the lifespan of any capability advantage is going to get shorter and shorter before something new comes along. And so together with the Home Office, we have set up the Innovation and Research Insight Unit, better known as IRIS. We know that these things cost money, so we've established an £800 million innovation fund to support suppliers with great new ideas in bringing them from concept to capability. And we know that inside the department we need to be held to account for innovation, so we have appointed a Defence Innovation Advisory Panel, led by the former chairman of McLaren Technology Group, Ron Dennis, to advise the Defence Secretary, drawing on the UK's world-class capabilities that we have in so many sectors: technology, cyber, encryption, pharmaceuticals, robotics, material science, to name just a few. And we are doing all of this internationally, including cooperating deeply with the DoD to bring new technologies into defence. Our final guiding principle, alongside international and innovation, is that integrated challenges call for integrated solutions. You will know how Russia in particular is using all of the levers of state power to pursue their interests. Russia's hybrid model demands a whole-of-government response. 10 years ago, we recognised that many of our security challenges were coming from weak and failing states, so we established a stabilisation unit, originally with staff from the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development, to take on those challenges in a holistic and strategic way. Today, the stabilisation unit brings together members of the armed forces, police officers and civil servants from 12 government departments to continue that mission. Today we face state-based threats too, which demand different structures. For example, we brought together some policy teams in the Foreign Office and the MOD, and in my old department from the Foreign Office and Energy. Today there is one joint unit for Euro-Atlantic security policy, one team led by one official, reporting to 2 Secretaries of State. We need less conventional relationships too. Once we could go on operations confident that the homeland was secure and resilient. We were an away games department after all, tackling threats at range so that we don't have to at home. But in today's conflicts, there is less and less distinction between home and away, and indeed between peace and war, and we must respond to that reality. So there are the 3 planks of our strategy: international, innovation and integration. They are not a panacea. Their identification itself will not deliver a lasting peace, but they can guide us as we review and adjust our plans sensibly, strategically, safely to a changing world, including the destabilising and aggressive actions of Russia and other states. And separately and together, these principles remind us in the UK how important it is to take on our challenges in harness with the United States. We think alike, but we are not the same. We deeply understand each other, but we can still offer a different perspective. There is no other country that can play the role of the United States in the rules-based international system. And there is no closer US ally than the UK, on the UN Security Council or anywhere else, who can help you achieve your goals. There is no other country whose technology sector can drive the kind of innovation NATO now requires to deliver 21st century defence. and there is no closer US ally than the one whose Tizard mission in the Second World War brought you the first radar that you could fit on fighter aircraft, the designs for the first jet engine, and the blueprint for the nuclear bomb. Our people work together, train together, study together, deploy together, fight together, and die together. Military and civilian, government and industry, they are the very best of their generation. Across all that we do, we have been, we are, we will remain the very closest of allies. We face a more challenging future. We have a plan to respond. Let us do so together. And with that, I'd be delighted to take your questions.
Let me begin, Stephen, by thanking you for those remarks and for underlining the special relationship and indeed for embodying it in your presence here. Let me begin by asking you about Brexit. We hear a great deal since June from self-serving people suggesting that Brexit means that the UK basically opts out of European defense and that this requires a separate European defense identity. Now, you touched on this during your prepared remarks, but if I could, I'll ask you to say a little bit more about that allegation.
It is an allegation which has been made, and I have to say it really could not be further from the truth. We are leaving the European Union, and I don't think anybody should labour under the misapprehension that somehow that will not happen. But we are profoundly European. The UK is part of Europe. We cannot, tow ourselves into the middle of the Atlantic and pretend that we're not. And I do think that the idea that the European Union is going to somehow recreate the kind of protective umbrella that NATO has been capable of providing over the last 70, 80 years, I think is nonsensical. If I look at the enhanced forward presence missions, which are all coming into action this year, those are all in members of the EU, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. They are all there to guarantee and be ultimate guarantors of, and really tangible symbols of how NATO guarantees European safety and security. And if we had left already, 3 of those missions would be led by non-EU countries. It would be the US, Canada, the UK. I mean, I think that is a sense in which, of course, the EU is very important, but the interconnections between our various countries go much, much deeper than that. And anybody who imagines that somehow or other leaving the European community is going to change that, I think has really got it profoundly wrong.
Right. Thank you. As I sit here, I see the image of President Trump on the screens out there. Let me ask you a bit of an unfair question, which is, to what degree do you think the President's call, echoed by Secretaries Mattis and Tillerson, for European members of the alliance to increase their defense spending has had any resonance, that it will have any effect on defense spending on the continent?
Well, as a matter of fact, I think it probably has had quite a lot of resonance. It is a subject of conversation, probably not in the, not in all of the saloon bars across Europe, but certainly in places where it hadn't been a proper conversation. And it has become so in the last few months, really. And in particular, I think that the Secretary of Defence's comments about Europe needing to show as much commitment to the people of Europe as America has done have resonated extremely powerfully from somebody who has been a former supreme commander of NATO. So I think it has made a difference, actually. The UK was one of the original authors of those kinds of commitments. But we are glad that they are having more bite now than perhaps they have hitherto. I mean, I do think there will be a moment coming up when we need to think quite carefully about what 2% means for each of the members of NATO. There are certain elements of spending which certain countries may choose to do, which will be more helpful than other parts of spending. And I think we need to fairly soon get into a more granular discussion about where those points of difference actually are, so that NATO as a whole can operate in a more sort of kind of holistic way with the right level of capabilities and skills. But let's concentrate on the head mark of 2%, and let's also not forget the 20% of expenditure on equipment as well. I mean, that is a really important part of those commitments that, again, we wouldn't like to see missed.
Right. Well, let me turn to the audience. There are faces I recognize. There are microphones on either side, and when I call on you, would you please stand and at least identify yourself so that we all know who's asking the question? Stephen knows particularly. Harlan.
Thank you for your presentation. I would like to get your advice.
Harlan Ullman.
Sorry, I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. So Frank, thank you. It was not entirely clear what the Obama administration's strategy was towards either Russia or the Islamic State. It is even less clear what the Trump administration's strategy is towards both. As you know, the Obama administration's first defense priority was the ability to deter and, if necessary, defeat Russia in a war. But when you asked that question to Ash Carter or Joe Dunford, you really didn't get much of a firm answer. So in terms of our overarching strategy, what do you think the tenets of a strategy towards Russia ought to be? And how do you think we ought to be addressing the Islamic State in ways that perhaps we're not doing now?
I think that the approach to Russia is going to be manifold, and I will pick out some of the points of it that the British government feels strongly about. I'll leave the American government to develop its own policies. The invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea was the first forcible seizure of land in Europe since the Second World War, and that is not something that can be forgotten lightly. So the UK government is committed to keeping sanctions and other restrictions on Russia for as long as it takes to rectify that position. We don't want to go to a, well, it's a fait accompli and move on. Thank you very much. And I think that is the view that most of our European allies hold firm to as well, and I hope that the new American administration will stay the same. I think we do want to engage. In fact, actually, with Russia, I think it is important that the lines of communications are open so that we can understand how their doctrine is evolving, and it has evolved a lot. Actually, it's evolved quite a lot more than NATO's and the West's have, and I want to make sure that nobody would ever accuse people in the West of falling into the trap of miscalculation or not understanding where Russia is coming from. So I think I mentioned what the Prime Minister said about engage but beware. I think that's what we are doing. My colleague, the Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, went over to see his colleague last week, in fact, in order to make some of those points and to generate a conversation there. Our Foreign Secretary is going over to meet Mr. Lavrov fairly soon as well. So we are committed to engaging, but in a very measured and wary fashion. And I would say that NATO is principally there in order to ensure the stability and security of the North Atlantic and Europe to a certain extent, but certainly the North Atlantic as well. And the biggest threat to that is Russia. So I think that NATO needs to be configured quite clearly to be able to meet that threat. So this is not an aggressive posture, it needs to be a defensive posture, but we do need to make sure that it is properly configured for the threat. In terms of ISIS, I think we can see sufficient progress on the ground now to feel confident that that ground war will be won relatively soon. The task then will turn to, I think, making sure that upstream interventions don't allow for the resurgence and export of that kind of violence in the future. So I talked a little bit earlier on about the 0.7% that we spend on international development. It's for sure that we need to think very, very carefully with our colleagues in the Foreign Office and international development as to how we can best direct our efforts, our money, to make sure that this scourge doesn't reappear. Trying to exterminate absolutely every single last element of it to the exclusion of looking beyond, I think would be probably a mistake.
Rose, please.
Thank you. Chris McNulty from Applied Futures. You spoke about the various threats that we're facing and called them hybrid threats and said that they require hybrid responses. Do you interpret the American view of the grey zone, which is partially hybrid, partially unconventional warfare, as being similar to what you call the hybrid threats? And also, you mentioned your stabilization unit, which certainly contains a lot of different organizations within the government. Do you see that as perhaps the start of a whole-of-government approach? I mean, you mentioned that it's quite small. But do you see that as a start of a whole-of-government? And do you think that we should be doing something similar?
So is the hybrid threat, which, and I know this is slightly in a sense it's slightly hackneyed, is it the same as those grey zone threats? Yes, it is. I mean, that is how we are thinking about it. Our understanding of doctrine is being developed by some of our potential adversaries, as I say, is, I think, in some ways rather more advanced than ours. We are intensely aware of some of the things that we might be confronting when we deploy to Latvia. We had recent, obviously we know what a bit of the playbook looks like as a result of the Ukraine and Crimea. So, I mean, yes, all of these things are very much within the scope of what I was talking about there. Certainly the Ministry of Defence doesn't have all of the answers to that. We have actually been spending quite a lot of time picking the brains of other departments, for instance our Department of Culture, Media and Sport, because the communications challenge and propaganda challenge is something actually where I think we recognise that we don't have all of the answers. So that is where a whole of government approach certainly seems and needs to be applied. On the stabilisation unit, yes, there's absolutely no question about that. I think we can see in a whole host of different places, sub-Saharan Africa, Bangladesh, many places around the globe. Threats emerging which are not susceptible to straightforward military intervention or military advice. And we are absolutely committed to building up those joint units such that they don't feel small, they do feel the go-to places for the subject matter they're dealing with. I mean, the one that I dealt with when I was at the Department for Energy and Climate Change was in fact the whole of that unit in my department, and the whole of that unit, they were both obviously doing the same things in the Foreign Office, put together and working together. It was put together just before the oil price collapse, actually, and the value and utility that the whole of government got out of it as a result was very, very meaningful. It was a very good example of the practice actually coming good. Whether or not it is a model that America should follow, I'll go out on I'd be a bit surprised if it didn't make sense for you to pool what I suspect may well be duplicated resources occasionally around the plot to make the whole, greater than the sum of the parts. I don't know how easy or difficult that is to do in institutional terms. I'm not naive on that front, but if you can do it, I think that we have certainly seen real advantage from it.
Yeah, with an understaffed government right now, it'll be interesting to see. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Paolo von Schirach, President of the Global Policy Institute, on a slightly different geographic area, Iran. Does the UK, your government, believe that the nuclear deal reached by the Obama administration is still the best thing that could be achieved? And kind of in conjoint to that, do you see any of the expectations of the Obama administration that tying up Iran in a positive new arrangement with the West on nuclear affairs has actually delivered on the expectations that Iran's foreign policy would be sort of become mellower? And how do you view in that respect the future of Syria and the possibility of Iran gaining a permanent foothold and joining basically with Hezbollah and its influence in Syria, and indeed the established influence in Iraq? In other words, how do you view the whole thing?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We certainly do look upon the Iran deal as the best hope for bringing Iran into the position of being a responsible, ideally non-nuclear armed country. We supported the deal then, and we support it now. I'm not quite sure exactly where the American position has landed on it at the moment, but we will be seeking to convince the administration, if they do have any doubts, that this is the right deal to do. I think there's a lot of onus on the Iranians themselves to make the most of the freedoms that the lifting of some of the restrictions that it sort of kind of exemplifies and embodies, and that I suspect has got some way to go. I think that people will have to see the benefit of that deal for what we know to be sort of kind of longer term social pressures to sort of kind of unwind in a beneficial way. So I think it is early stages. I mean, I would say that when you ask the question, can you therefore see Iran behaving more responsibly? I guess the answer to that is no, not very much. However, I do think that the situation in Syria is so extreme, and they have chosen to play in that in that arena in a way that means that probably we can't necessarily see it just now. I mean, I think it will be for the next iteration to work out whether or not actually Iran is living up to its side of the bargain.
Ambassador Bob Hunter.
Thank you. Robert Hunter. I used to be at NATO. Could I press you a bit more on Brexit? A lot of it, of course, goes beyond your remit at MOD, but Britain's role within the European Union has not just been the kinds of things we read about in the newspaper. Part of it is to help the balance with the Germans and the French. Part of it is the non-military aspects of dealing with security in Central Europe, including with Ukraine. Part of it's the trade issues within the community, the union rather, and across the Atlantic. I'm reassured by what you said about continuing to take part in European Union military activities when appropriate. But do you really believe, or if you do believe, how would you go about being able to punch at your weight, if not even above your weight, if you're not going to be fully a part of the European Union institutions at a time of such great stress?
I don't have a perfect crystal ball. I don't know exactly how the UK will be positioned in 10 years' time. I suspect that there will be areas where we will feel the loss of EU membership keenly. I suspect there will be areas where we will think to ourselves that we have been liberated from a whole bunch of things, and we're doing a lot of exciting things which otherwise we would find difficult to do. It's the decision, however, that the country has made, and the resolution of the UK government and everybody who's working in it is to make the best of that decision, which definitely has opportunities as well as things that we need to deal with. Now, I think there are a whole host of areas where we are not going to resile from our broader European responsibilities. I mean, we've talked about security, but actually the issues to do with policing across Europe, where in fact actually European partners are very dependent on UK capabilities, are also an area where we are going to play a full part. It is in our interest and it is in their interest as well, and it would be sort of immoral not to do so. So I think that we can sort of kind of take this idea that the UK is leaving the EU sort of kind of too far, frankly. I mean, there are going to be lots and lots of areas where we're not going to be leaving it. I mean, where the UK is going to be in terms of sort of being the preferred partner into the EU, if that's one of your points, well, you know, we'll see. We will still be, you know, we'll still be a member of the G7. We will still be a powerful and I hope authoritative voice on the world stage. We will have different types of trading relationships. And, you know, who knows what Europe itself will look like in a few years' time.
In the back, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Andrew Hanna. I'm a reporter at Politico. In your opening remarks, you mentioned how the United Kingdom was looking to boost European capabilities to counter hybrid threats. And will the United Kingdom help set up the European Commission's proposed countering hybrid threat center potentially in Finland? And how do you make sure that those efforts don't duplicate efforts already undertaken by NATO?
Well, we are a member of the European Union until we're not a member of the European Union. So to the extent that the centre in question is up and running, yeah, we will certainly be involved. And we have probably the best technologists in this area in Europe. And we will want to make sure that European security benefits from that. So we will want to stay close to that. I would imagine that when we leave the European Union, that may well be one of the types of cooperation that we will want to continue. Frankly, you know, these wires and cables and code do not really respect international boundaries very obediently, and as a result, we need to recognise that as being a transnational threat that the UK is personal, you know, national interests are served by getting involved in. I certainly wouldn't want to see duplicated capability, and except insofar as it is in some form or other additive. On that basis, I think that actually the question is more interestingly, is NATO as an organisation moving as quickly as it should be into that kind of area? Is it a sensible strategy to leave this to national governments? I think that my instinct on that is probably not, but that's I think where I would put the focus of that.
Probably have time for one more question. Yeah, I think you put them back. Let me then just say that I hope as you leave this room today, you take two things away from what Stephen said in his prepared remarks. First, the enormous military, technological, and scientific capability which the United Kingdom brings to our NATO alliance, and to include systems which are on the cusp of being deployed, the carriers, the F-35s, the P-8 patrol aircraft, and indeed in a few years' time, the Dreadnought-class SSBNs. That's the first thing. The military, technical, and scientific support that the UK provides to the only organization which really provides for the true defense of the North Atlantic region against a major power threat. The second thing is the special relationship. There are some of you here today who embody that. But every day, thousands of Brits and Americans are working together in the intelligence field, the scientific field, in all branches of the military services and the diplomatic corps. They do so as the third or fourth generation of 70 years of special relationship. It doesn't really matter whether the tabloids focus on whether the gift that the president gave the prime minister, vice versa, was adequate in the eyes of the press. The special relationship is unique. It's generational. It's something that all of us have to pass on to the next generation to make certain that this absolutely unique aspect of the Anglo-American relationship continues. So, Stephen, thank you for being here. Thank you for your remarks and for what you've brought to us here. And please join me in thanking Stephen.